No, chair wants the first one. Oh. Oh, okay, that's first. Okay, so then I'll. So that hasn't eaten you much, TLS? It doesn't seem like it's been a bad week for TLS. There's a lot of documentation we ran over. Like good document discussion. Yes, correct. What often bad discussion.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first inaugural GitHub Integration and Tooling Working Group meeting, fresh out of the charter phase. This is the note well. I'm sure you've seen this several times so far. So note the usual things and note them well. Quick overview of the agenda. We're going to spend, of course, blue sheets are floating around somewhere, so please fill them out once you get them. We do need a Jabber scribe, so I'm hopeful someone will raise their hand and volunteer.
At least a Jabber watcher, so somebody who would be willing to go to the mic. Thank you. Visual Jabber watch. Is there someone who would like to take minutes? Is there someone who would like, Matt would like to take minutes? Thank you.
Review and revision or bashing of the agenda. This is basically what we have. We're going to discuss a couple, working group process things before we get started into the two documents that we have on plate. The first one of which is a working group adopted document, and another one for Martin is possibly up for adoption as well. So I see Dan coming to the mic.
Hello, could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, sorry. Is this good? Sorry? Okay, I'll speak very closely. That's good. Right, so assuming everyone is okay with the agenda then, just move forward. So Mark Nottingham politely pointed out an issue on the data tracker, we were pointing back to the old legacy track system for issue tracking and not GitHub, and it raises the larger question as to whether or not the GitHub working group is actually using GitHub. And in following the best practices document and the configuration document, the procedure by which we would start doing so is to make sure that the working group is actually on board with doing this. So at this time, I'd just sort of like to ask the group, are we okay with using GitHub in some capacity? I'm not specifying exactly what capacity, because that's the second question to answer. Do we want to use GitHub for the documents adopted by the working group?
Duh.
Does anyone violently object to this proposal? Okay, thank you. I guess a more difficult question then is, in what capacity should be using GitHub? So Martin's document describes different ways that working groups can use GitHub, varying from, one end of the extreme, like quick, using issues and pull requests to drive things forward, moving to the list once you need things for consensus, versus using GitHub as a way to just track documents and have most discussion take place on the list. So the proposal we have for us right now is to have the working group documents in the GitHub organization on GitHub, file issues there, but just have all substantive discussions take place on the list. Considering that we don't expect a lot of churn, much like Quick, that seems like a fairly reasonable proposal to at least the chairs. So we'd like to hear what the working group participants think of this idea. Martin.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. Wow, I have to really eat it.
Yeah.
I think this is the right way to do this. This is, as a process type arrangement, this is a group that will probably bring in people who are not familiar with the processes that we're talking about, who are not familiar with GitHub and that world. And if we start having discussions on GitHub and hiding things from them, we might end up with surprises. and I would rather have the substantive discussion on the mailing list. I realize that's the conservative approach here, but I think it's probably appropriate. And as you said, it's not going to be hugely high traffic on the documents themselves. I think we're going to be talking about most of that stuff today, and that'll be right.
Right, thank you. Brian.
Brian Dremel. Plus one to that, working in two working groups, one quick and two taps, both of which use GitHub. I think this process requires a little bit more discipline of the editors to be able to say, okay, this issue is actually crossing the line, move it over. It's worked well in both the working groups that I've seen it in. One additional piece of tooling that can be a backstop of that is a script that goes by and posts issue changes summary to the list. So Quick does that. I have an action item to get that up before the TAPS working group meeting tomorrow. So yeah, I think we have running code for this one and it works pretty well. So I do it here too.
Okay.
What's left missed? Just to share a personal opinion, although I understand.
Can you speak a little closer? Sorry.
Okay. Although I understand and support the approach of using GitHub for certain type of problems and then the mailing list for the substantive discussion, you'll find that over time it will be very hard to separate the two, because often you raise an issue and a lot of substantive discussion happens on GitHub. It will require a lot of discipline and policy setting by the chairs to actually make it happen. But good luck with that. I think it's a good.
So do note that this says file issues on GitHub, not discuss them on GitHub. That is so that we use GitHub as an issue topic list, not as an issue discussion list for this.
And sometimes you might want to record the status of the issues as discussions happen on the mailing list and in these meetings. I think the point was well made about the fact that things tend to bleed into those issues and people tend to just pile on issues. We had this experience early on in HTTP 2 where we followed a very similar process to what's being proposed. And yes, initially it does require a little bit of vigilance, but when you get past a certain point, the regular participants start doing the job of the chairs and the editors and whatnot for you. And so it tends to build a little momentum, and it turns out to be quite workable long term. I'm not sure this is going to be a long-term working group though. So I think we'll just have to rely on a little bit of extra effort from the chairs here. I trust we can manage that.
Perfectly reasonable, and we're willing to do that. All right, so hearing no objections, we'll go forward with that particular process, file all the issues on the GitHub documents, and we'll have all the discussion take place on the list, just so that everyone can follow along, for those not familiar with the tooling and the process of using GitHub to the extent that groups like Quick use it. So the next order of business is on tooling and projects that are relevant to the particular working group. So several of you who may have already used or GitHub in a working group that you're participating in are probably familiar with some of the tools listed here, in particular Martin's template tool for generating markdown drafts. Quite useful. Rich has some scripts as well. There's also this scraping script that Brian was referring to earlier that would post issues from GitHub and summarize them to the mailing list. Certainly we would like to see these continue to be developed and maintained to the extent that they serve and add value to the people who are using GitHub in their working groups. A question we have for folks in this room is to what extent, or what are some other tools rather that would benefit working groups using GitHub in varying capacities. So for example, what new tools would benefit folks in the Quick working group who use it very heavily for review and discussion of material instead of having that all take place on the list. So there's a link here to a wiki which has some ideas. We can pull them up, but be curious to hear what others think are some things that might be some added value. Yeah, Dan.
Dan York, Internet Study, but not speaking for Internet Study. So maybe you just answered my question with that last link, and I didn't see that because my eyes are bad. But is that a description of what these tools are?
Can you repeat the question?
So is that last link a description of what these tools are and how people can use them?
The last link on the bottom of the page?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Is that what it is? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, because I think that's the piece would be, one comment I've had from people who've been trying to work with this is they don't understand what tools are available to work with IDs and things we have there. So whatever documentation or however we can improve that would be great. And I will take a look at that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this seems like an amply good topic for brainstorming in the wiki. I'm not sure how useful it is to discuss now.
It's trying to just put it on everyone's radar and plug it here. So certainly go and look at the wiki
Sure.
and see if you can make edits. But if there's something that you think everyone should hear in this particular room,
But I see a line forming behind me, which makes
yes,
me
it
wonder.
clearly worked.
Alyssa Cooper. I just wanted to emphasize their documentation piece, sort of to what Dan was saying. But I think for some parts of the community, the hard part here is understanding the existing tools, not that they need more or different tools. So if there are volunteers who want to work on the documentation, I think that would be most welcome. Are you volunteering, Martin? I thought you had anti-volunteered before. You can get, thank you.
So to emphasize that, wearing a different hat, I was editor of the initial RFC new RFC format, the V3 format. And one of the things we heard constantly was that, yes, there were tools out there for doing interesting things, but they weren't well documented. As they got better documented, we saw a rapid increase in use by by people other than early adopters. So documentation here is especially important for people using the tools the first time. So if you find a tool that you think it's useful and you struggle with it and you make it useful, by all means write down what your struggle was. That is actually really helpful for literally thousands of people after you.
Or alternatively, file issues on the tool pages themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi,
Barbara.
Stark. I would love to help with the documentation. I've actually used some of this to get some GitHub sites up and running for 2 of my working groups, and I've actually also used them for my personal repository to work on a draft. And as someone who doesn't do code and doesn't comprehend how to read makefiles and things like that, I think I could probably be really useful in helping provide documentation for people like me, because while I've used it, what I've done is seriously broken. And so that's good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Mike Bishop. I will also add that what we need is not just documentation on the individual tools, but in the entire process. Because Rich's scripts are great in that they will set up a repo for you and they'll give you the commands to run to set up the ID template. You really are kind of on your own for figuring out how to get Circle up and running, how to get the notify scripts running, because we don't have a unified workflow of you go into GitHub, you create this repo, you add the template to it, you hook up Circle. All of those are separate tasks. They're documented in different places, and not all of them are well documented.
Fair. I was just going to point out, yeah, Martin's document does describe how to set up Circle. But to your point, yeah, some of the documentation is scattered, and it would be nice if it could be collated in a single place for everyone to use. So can I just get a show of hands from folks in the room who would be interested in potentially helping develop / maintain / add documentation / comment on usefulness / pretty much help with this overall effort? Right. Cool. How that actually take place, we don't really have a specific process in mind. I minimally, take a look at the tools, try to file issues for improving documentation right now. And perhaps Paul and I can go off and think of something more formal if we need to. But just start using them and tell the folks who maintain them potentially what's wrong with them and how they can be improved. That would be at least a way to get started.
So, and as a note on this, this is tooling, not kind of software that you might expect in GitHub. So an issue of, I don't understand how to do this thing is a perfectly reasonable issue, whereas you would normally get jumped on in GitHub for a comment like that. That's actually valuable here. Because we had a fair smattering of hands of people who said that they were willing to do documentation. Even an issue of, I got halfway through the tool and then I stopped because of this. That's just fine. We wouldn't mind that at all.
Right. So on that note, that's the last slide. So we'll move on to the first presentation, which is Alyssa. Right. Yes, she can click. Right. Hold up the clicker.
Sure. So since the last meeting, this draft was adopted by the working group, and then we did one revision. Changes are pretty minimal and not visible on the screen. The clicker doesn't work or something. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there were 3 changes. The first one was a slight modification in the abstract. So before it used to say that the working group does not intend to change the processes used by current working groups. There was a little bit of lack of clarity about whether this meant that working groups that are currently using GitHub could change their processes to align with whatever we produce here if they wanted to. So we changed this. So now it says that current working groups are not required to change their process, but leaves open the possibility that they still could. The second change was about adding a sentence to note the existence of other code repository services, possibly with different properties. There was some discussion on the list about this, and people wanted it to be noted in this draft, even though this draft is specifically about GitHub. And then lastly, we had this old note that was in there about needing to research the API for connecting personnel into the data tracker, and the tools team can work on this. We don't need it to be noted in the draft. There's this open question about the relationship between this document and Martin's GitHub BCP document. We reference it extensively in this document, but we weren't exactly sure what's going to happen with Martin's document. So perhaps after he presents, we can talk about that.
Yes, we will talk about that at that point.
Okay. That's it. Comments, questions? Everybody's perfectly happy with this thing?
Martin Thompson, I have a bit of material on the relationship between this one and my document in the presentation coming up. So maybe we can talk about it more there.
Sounds
Talk
good.
about them together, perhaps.
Oh, sounds great.
Yeah, we sort of view these as sort of codependent documents that go hand in hand. So yes, we can talk about it in just a little bit.
Okay. Sounds like that's it.
No questions? Yeah, 30 minutes. Flew by. Martin, yeah.
Oh, click it. Wow, I don't have that many. Yeah, I didn't know what to put on the title slide, so that's what we have.
Chicken.
Yeah, chicken. Or maybe it's my name. Right, so yeah, one of the critical questions I think in discussing this will be the relationship between the two drafts that we talked about. So I set things up a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about why I put this document together and how it sort of approaches its discussion. The goal of this is largely to describe how things work, how you might interact with those things. It spends a lot of time carving out various areas where there be dragons. Because I think that's one of the things that is particularly dangerous in this area. There's a lot of ways you can use these tools that don't work productively, and so wow, this is really gainy. And so having a lot of documentation on the things that you might think would be a good idea but aren't really in practice is very useful, I find.
And that means that as a general thing, the document tries to sort of guide people towards particular approaches. It doesn't have any strict template or saying, here's the things that you will do. It simply says, if you do these things, understand that these have these consequences and you might want to do this sort of thing. So if we're talking about documenting processes, the current form of the document isn't entirely suitable for that sort of thing. But it does provide a lot of information for someone who's setting this process up to make their own choices. I don't know whether this is a good thing or not, and I'd like some input on that when we get to the discussion part of this presentation. So one of the things that I think is particularly challenging here is that the way that we use these tools and the things that we know about how these tools operate is evolving, and the tools themselves are changing. And for instance, we're having a discussion now in Quick about how we manage the consensus process and what the tools can do to support that. And there's probably a lot more learning in that area before we can really say anything concrete about what to do. Unfortunately, RFCs are really bad at capturing these sorts of things. In a past life, I spent quite a lot of time doing quality assurance training and TL 9000 certification, all those wonderful things. And part of the approach there was that you would have a continuous evolution of the processes that you have. And one of the philosophies that I learned in that was that you capture what you're doing rather than what you might aspire to be doing. And that's another aspect of this one that I think we'll have to be aware of as we go into this. I don't expect that any document that is produced in this vein will be valid in 5 years' time. It's an RFC, you're going to stamp it in stone, but then it's going to be almost immediately invalid. So we have to be sensitive to that. That's why maybe having processes documented more concretely would be a bad idea. I realize that I've talked about this document in its various versions twice. I've presented on it, and I've never actually gone through what's in it. I think we've been talking about other things in relation to that. So I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview of what's going on here. At a sort of high level, there's some mechanical parts to it. It's sort of how the IETF and GitHub interaction works. Robert, did you have a question you want to ask now, or do you want to hold it off for a bit?
Was Robert Sparks, is to comment on a point you made on your last slide about not documenting details. I think that it would be useful to capture the details, but just frame them as at this time the following happened, because you will have people come back in 5 years or 10 years and look at this and try to understand how things evolved, and it would be good to actually have concrete touchstones to help decipher what was really happening.
Yeah, I think probably we need to have some sort of banner on it that says this is where we are right now, and things might change, but it doesn't have that at the moment. So there's a bunch of the document that deals with sort of the mechanics of the interactions, making organizations and assigning permissions to people and whatnot. There's a bunch of things about how you bootstrap this process and how the working group decides to do this, and the policies that the working group might evolve. Then there's a chunk of discussion about the features that are available, how you use them, the pitfalls that are inherent in that use, and some guidance after that sort of walks through some of the other things. There's a whole section on assessing, how you manage the consensus process with a tool like this. And there's another discussion about advising editors, for instance, on what would be a good practice. So the sort of structural stuff, there's a considerable overlap between this and the document that Alyssa and Paul have put together on this one. It talks about how to set up organizations, repositories, and even to some extent what sort of tools are available on the data tracker, which is something that's going to change in like 2 weeks. So I don't think that's really going to make a whole lot of sense. My proposal here is to try to remove as much of this stuff from the document as possible and move it over to the other document. I think most of this is strictly duplicative at the moment. There may be a few things that we need to look at, but I'd like to make sure that we do that. So if anyone disagrees with me, I'd like to hear that. Excellent. Do as I say. Speaking of doing as I say, the process that a working group might go through to decide to use GitHub is a particular point here that the document spends quite a bit of time on. In doing so, you end up talking a little bit about the features that are available in GitHub and what working groups might use them for or not. But there's a small section in here that talks about the process by which a working group might do that and the various trade-offs that you might make, similar to the discussion that we just had during Chris's presentation here. And so for me, I'm interested in asking the question, how specific should we be in this advice? Currently it's fairly loose, and it could be more specific. We could do things like saying, well, here's a particular playbook, as it were. We're following the light touch playbook, as if you want to say it. And then there's also the quick style and deep integration, where you have a lot of the discussion on things on GitHub. Those, I think, are the two main things that have sort of emerged out of the experience that we've had. But if there's anything more, obviously we can have a look at that as well. But does this need to actually write down those interaction models more clearly as you know, option A or option B or what have you, so that we can have sort of handles to grab onto? And I think we can open the lines on this one.
From the mailing list, I think those were the two main choices.
That's the impression I get as well. Yeah.
So far, there might be more later, but I think that that's a reasonable start. And one thing that I heard this week off list was somebody saying, we're thinking of getting, of doing it. I think we'll end up heavy, but if we start light, we'll be able to figure out how to go from light to heavy. So you don't need a transition model, just how to get them going light, and they'll stumble into it. At least that was a hallway thing for me.
Oh, that's a good point. I don't think there's any discussion in here about how you might evolve the process, but obviously the same process for starting can be used to transition, but we probably need to write that down. Thanks.
So it's been, Barbara Stark, it's been my experience. So in broadband form, we've been doing a lot of things with all the Atlassian stuff. So we've got the bit bucket and all these other things, and trying to educate people kind of similarly to, I think, what you're trying to do here, that we don't have all these extensive tools, but you really need someplace like a README, MD, and instructions there that are a living document. And I think a lot of the things you're talking about here really need to be in a living document, that as tools change, because the tools are going to be changing regularly. And you need to update your document regularly. And as people have questions, you need to update all that regularly. And I think a lot of what you're talking about here really needs to go in that sort of thing and not in a static document.
Yeah, so it might be that we develop guidelines here and simply say that the working groups maintain one of these things in a prominent location. I don't know what that advice will be concretely, but it sounds like good advice.
Alyssa Cooper. So building off of that, there is a little bit of discussion starting in the IESG about a stream of living documents that we might experiment with. So these would not be RFCs. So some portion of this, I see Mark is dancing in the front, might be candidate for that. But I think it'd be really useful to separate the pieces that people do think are going to be dynamic and continue to change, and the pieces that are not. Like, I was just thinking about this slide is called deciding to use GitHub. Like, hopefully the little bit in the draft, which actually talks about how to decide is not going to change a lot. Then it's like what the choices are and all of that, like that might change, right? So I can see that. But there's also a substantive separation in those things. Like one of these is about like how does a working group run itself, a sort of like BCP 25 update kind of thing. And then the other is like, here's a bunch of things that they could choose to do once they're following the process of how they run. And I think keeping those conceptually separate will be useful to get this, to get the part that does need to become an RFC advanced through the IETF.
So Alyssa, before you go, so if what comes out of this working group, especially the work on Martin's thing, is that we should have a static document and a living-esque document, are we, this working group, going to get borked on how do we set up a living document?
Yeah, so I really don't want that to happen.
Yeah, I don't either, but
and
you
I
just
think,
started with the word yeah.
interestingly, no other working group that wants to use living documents wants that to happen either, presumably, because that's kind of the point. Like, it's very meta. Like the people who really want to do living documents definitely don't want to like wait for some process so that they can do living documents. So like this is extremely preliminary. Like I didn't even ask the IHG if I could talk about this before I came to the microphone because we've literally like only exchanged a few emails about it, but we have been talking about it since Bangkok. So I can't really tell you much about what the shape of this is going to be because like I might walk into the IESG meeting tomorrow and everybody says we hate this, we don't want to do it. But I think if it starts to look like this will get hung up, then like just leave it in a draft. A draft is great. A draft is a living document that you can update anytime. So it need not get hung up on that.
Okay, good. Because I just having lived through the wars of say having an IESG literally 20 years ago tell us, Russ Hasley and I, keep a living document, and we did, and then we got beaten up for it later when it finally got instantiated. I don't want that to happen here because that would be a really bad example for exactly the topic that we have here. So, okay. So we might keep, even if the working group closed down, we might keep a draft alive until the way that things can live is decided.
Joe Hall, do we have a good feel for like the minimal set of like normative things that we need to say? Like if you're going to use GitHub, whatever, you must do these things. It seems small, but I don't have a good feel for what that is. And it seems like the rest of the stuff is like, hey, if you're going to think about it, here's some really good experience that we can encapsulate in a document, and that sounds all great. But I'm having a hard time seeing the sort of that minimal set of, yeah, you're going to do this.
Yeah, so Joe, that's a really good question. And when I looked at this, the amount of things that concretely fall into this category of stuff that we can put in stone is relatively small, but it may be important for us to put them in stone so that we can have some way to bootstrap the process and have a formal statement from a consensus statement of the IETF, ideally, that says, this is how you decide to use one of these tools, and these are the sorts of things you need to consider when establishing them. And I know that Mark Nottingham had a draft about using third-party services, and then there may be some things in there that are relevant to this, but the sort of things I'm thinking about there is the decision-making process that you follow, the content on this slide, the way that you assess consensus when dealing with external tools like this, I think is probably quite critical to have in one of those documents. And there may be some of the things that is in the document that Alyssa and Paul have put together about the way that the ownership arrangements are set up on these things. It may need to be abstracted a little bit because the document that we have is very, very concrete, which is a good thing. But if you wanted to create a process document that was a little higher level, then it would look like a much reduced thing. I can imagine it only being a couple of pages, and we don't have to deal with that very, very much. But the that document as an update to RFC, what BCP 25, I think you said. I don't remember all the numbers, but an update to that or something that was related to that would be possibly a good thing to consider doing. We just don't have one right now. All right. So the next topic is there's a bunch of stuff in the draft that falls in that category of things that are far too specific to really want to pin down at this point, and we may keep the document in draft form for some extended period of time, just so we can get more experience with these things. It talks about issues and pull requests and do you use the wiki and continuous integration and all these sorts of other things, and they're going to be very specific to the tools that you have. But what I think is important is having a document that captures all of the learning that we've gained, all the experience we've gained over the past 8 years or so since people have started doing this thing. So I like this part, but don't know what to do with it. There are 2 sections in here. We've had some discussion on the list about the consensus pieces of it. I think there's some work to be done here. I think the original versions of the document sort of took this laissez-faire approach where you can do whatever you want with the documents, which is fairly consistent with the way that documents are developed prior to this. But it sort of said that, well, you know, stuff happens on the document and editors make some sort of decisions on what goes in and out of the document. And then you come back to the working group, and ultimately the working group is a backstop on this thing. And you can even imagine saying that working group last call is the time when you make the final assessment about whether there's a consensus on any given thing. The thinking has evolved a lot past that. And so we have we've moved from the models that we have active discussion on the document and consensus to merge things at various stages of the lifetime of the document changes. So you can imagine that if you've got an individual draft, obviously the editors and the authors of an individual draft are just going to dump whatever they want in there, regardless of what the working group thinks, because it's not their business. Once something becomes a working group draft, there's a little higher bar for that. And one of the things we discovered with Quick in particular was that there was a need early in this process to give considerable leeway to editors in making decisions about what it was that went in the document and what was left out. And then we had sort of these attempts at processes to sort of retroactively bless the things that were in the document, and it gets really kind of complicated. And I'm fairly confident in saying that most people didn't really understand what was going on and what had consensus and what didn't have consensus. What I think we had was consensus that the documents were largely headed in the right direction, that we wanted to work on the protocol, but there wasn't a whole lot more than that. And so we've sort of come to the realization that there's multiple stages in the life cycle of a document where different processes are appropriate. And so the draft at the moment doesn't really capture this very well, and I think we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about how that works. Right now in Quick, we've moved to a far more formal process where the documents are considered to embody the current consensus of the document, absent any issues that the working group chairs agree are open issues on the document. That's a kind of an interesting process to be in, but it means that you have essentially consensus on all the bits of the document that are done, plus all of the things that are broken. Now, you only have consensus that they're broken. You don't necessarily have consensus on the solutions to any of those things, but you have sort of a baseline for working, and then every single change that's substantive on the document reduces the set of known broken things and moves the document closer and closer to being done. And so that sort of process is much more appropriate later in the life cycle of a document. And we sort of saw that informally happen in the late stages of, say, TLS 1.3, where we would have extensive discussion on substantive changes before they went into the document. But that was informal. We didn't have any real recognition that we were transitioning between one phase and another. I think this is generally how documents are developed. Once they get more mature in the process, we sort of see people being more sensitive to change and being more proactive in gaining working group consensus and relying more, on the judgment of chairs. But this needs a little bit more work. So I guess Mike, you have some insights.
Mike Bishop, I was just going to comment. I don't think we actually, when we say we have an issue, we're not saying that we have consensus that it's a problem. We do not have consensus that what's in the document is right.
Right. Okay, that's a great clarification. Mike has decided to block the hallway.
Absolutely. Mark Nottingham. I really do have to eat this. So the late stage process that we introduced in Quick, which short advertisement, we started using a project board to manage the stages of that process. GitHub introduced project boards, I guess, a year or so ago, and it's lots of fun. You're gamifying this. It's really cool. I would encourage people to try it out. We introduced that largely due to the specific situation that Quick's in that our charter says we start with these documents, but we explicitly don't have consensus on any of their contents. And so we needed a way to flip from that state to documents reflecting consensus. And that's why, one of the reasons why the late stage process was introduced.
Yeah.
Early impressions, I've heard some concern because people didn't understand it, and we probably needed to explain it better, but so far it's going fairly smoothly. But it's a tool that may not be appropriate in other situations. Regarding what Mike said, the issues, I think we've said this before, but it's worth repeating. The issues are a little bit of a moral hazard in that you have some folks who, oh, look, it's an issues list, and I have dealt with lots of GitHub issues lists before I have an idea. Let's get it out in the world. And that does create sometimes a bit of a nightmare situation where you have this ever-increasing set of issues because people have an idea in the middle of the night or on the toilet or whatever. And so that's one of the reasons why you have a bar for accepting those for discussion in the working group. We've always said in HTTP as well as in Quick that the issues list is a mechanism that the chairs and the editors use to manage the conversation and the state of things in the world. It's not the arbiter of consensus. And it's important to reinforce that, I think.
Yeah, and so this is where the advice that we have in this document sort of crosses over into something that's a little more concrete, potentially. The view that issues and the management of issues represents working group consensus is a trap. And we learned that pretty early on. If you insist on working group consensus before making any change to the document, you end up in complete paralysis, particularly early on in the process. But like Mike said, it's a tool that we use for editors and chairs to manage the outstanding work. It's not really the final arbiter of consensus. That's the process that ultimately happens in the working group.
So Paul Hoffman, not wearing a hat here, but as somebody who's been in work, who has not been active in TLS, Quick, or HTTP, but has been active in other groups using GitHub. I think that the discussion so far has actually been driven by these groups that use it heavily and not by the groups that use it lightly. And so your question at the end here is how useful is this stuff? I think it actually might be useful to rip this stuff out because working groups that are going to adopt this in a gentle fashion might have a very different way of doing things. And there are plenty of working groups that do just fine with consensus on the list before a change happens in the document and such like that. So I would prefer, unless it was sort of a load-bearing section, to actually take out this kind of advice and possibly have something like a narrative of some groups that have used the heavy-duty version, like if we're going to go a light and heavy, that have used the heavy-duty version, describing how they used it and such. I think that it might scare away people from using the lightweight version.
So I don't think there's any intent to say that a working group couldn't decide to operate under that process. And so
I understand, but
the intent here is
it's the only one that's documented.
No, it's not the only one that's documented. There's a lot of text on there for the benefit of the heavyweight process, specifically because it's far more complicated.
Yeah.
But those groups that I've been in that do exactly the process that you talked about, make the decision and then just use the issue to track them. I think that's already covered in here, and maybe if I can get you to read it again and direct specific comments at it, that would be good.
Will do.
But it is intended to cover that case.
Yeah, I know it covers. So maybe if we do the split of light and heavy, then we take the advice and do it as light.
That might be the way to do it. Yeah.
That would make it, I think, clearer.
All right.
Yeah, I would not be in favor of removing this material. It's taken quite a while over several working groups to evolve a reasonable workflow that is GitHub heavy, and not removing that as a disservice to people who would like to replicate that in other working groups, unless the only people who are able to run GitHub are any Mark Nottingham and Sean Turner. So no, I don't think we should remove it. I do think it's useful to sort of set the stage of there's sort of two extreme up, right? One extreme is that GitHub is purely like a coordination tool, and and all consensus is declared entirely on the list with no, where you and there's another one where as a practical matter it's extremely hard to engage without without engaging with GitHub, right? And Quick and TLS, it's gotten extremely hard to engage, especially in Quick, without having some GitHub engagement. Certainly it's technically true that you could just read the documents as they came out, but there's a lot of inertia in the changes by the time you get to that point. So I think we have to sort of cover that spectrum. But I think it's taken so long to get to this point that I really wouldn't be in favor of not retaining that documentation.
Yeah, Rich Sauls. Rich Sauls. I agree with what Ecker said. Also, for groups that want to get further along on the learning curve or adoption or integration with GitHub, as you said, this is hard learned knowledge, and it shouldn't disappear in the ether. There are people who will not want to do it, and maybe we need to put more disclaimers that there's no requirement you do this. If you're concerned about using, a Microsoft-owned resource to manage some of your workflow, don't do that. Just do this part. But yeah, don't remove this.
Jeffrey Eskin. I'm hoping to set up a working group at IETF 105 or after IETF 105, and we will probably want to use GitHub heavily, and we want to rely, I will hope to rely on this advice when doing that.
Yeah, so the one that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about here is there's some sort of very low-level advice for editors about how to deal with contributions from outside of the community and all those sorts of things like that. If anyone has some opinions on that, I'd like to hear about that, but probably not right now. I don't think it's sort of core to what we're doing. What else have I got? Oh yeah, these are the questions. Does this have approximately the right scope with modulo the movement of all of the structural stuff to the other document? Is it worth publishing? Well, we've had that discussion. And is it this working group where it is most appropriate to do that? So I'll leave this with one with the chairs. I'm going to go and sit down.
Right. So can I get a quick show of hands as to who's read this particular document? I guess any version of it. Okay, pretty decent amount. It seems certainly like something that would benefit the community for numerous reasons, especially given that it kind of sort of collates all the, as we're saying, the knowledge that we've had to spend a long time accruing via Quick. Yes, thank you. It's Thursday, I haven't had coffee. To that point, I think I'd like to ask the working group if we think this document should be adopted, given the current scope of the material that's in there right now, which does contain some advice for the light and heavy variants of the groups who would like to use it. Doesn't dictate any particular profile for groups who want to use it. It simply just tries to guide people along the path that is best for them in their particular working group for their particular process. So the question will be, do you want to adopt this as a working group item, yes or no, but quickly, I think Martin is going to comment on something.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, you made a lot of reference to the light and heavies and all those sorts of other things in the scope of the document.
Yes.
The fact that it overlaps with the other document to some extent. All of that can change in this working group.
I sort of was assuming that the material, especially the material that overlaps with the configuration document, would be removed. There was no violent objection to that, and it seems silly to have the information duplicated. So, yes, to your point, yes, the information can change, especially because as a community, we are still learning how to use GitHub effectively. GitHub might change features that influence what's actually written down. For example, the issue tracker should be completely removed in favor of this Kanban taskboard thing, whatever. Yeah, things may change, but the question remains, should the working group have a document of this variety that sort of tries to document this information and advice for the benefit of other people trying to use it in either light or heavy mode. So if no one's going to get up to ask a question, I will just ask the question now. So please hum now if you think this document should be adopted by the working group. And please hum now if you do not. Laughter in the other room, that's not helpful, but.
Wasn't humming. So is there any individual who would like to speak? So what we heard was vast majority of hum. In fact, we didn't hear any hums against. Is there anyone who would like to speak against adopting this document in the working group at this point? Okay.
All right, so we will adopt it. Martin will submit a new version for the work group and we can move forward with it. We ask that people who, especially the people who are using GitHub in the light variant, please review it, provide suggestions as issues and discussion on the list regarding ways in which that particular advice could be improved, either in terms of turning off or maybe perhaps toning down or changing some language around the heavy profile such that it doesn't turn away people who want to use it for the light variant or whatever. Certainly, we want to make sure that the information that's available for any potential user of GitHub is maximally useful for them.
So and once we have it in the working group, Chris and I will take this to the working group chair's mailing list, because I am only active in working groups that are in the light mode, and it seems like the most active people here are in working groups in the bleeding edge mode. And it would be great, if there's anyone here now who is also in the light mode, but we will actively seek out working group chairs to contribute to how they are using it now, or how they would just like to start be using it.
So now that is done, Martin Thompson, there's a couple of things that came up in the discussion there. I'd like to get a sense of whether people think that it would be useful to try to break out those pieces of this document that are concretely actionable in terms of a process thing. So updates to BCP 25, for instance, that would say formalize the decision-making process perhaps, and maybe capture some of the key points of the consensus side of this. Is there any interest in having a document that maybe we could publish sooner? Maybe it doesn't have to be living. I don't need to get the response now, but I'd certainly like people's thoughts on whether that's worth doing.
Certainly to Alyssa's point earlier, in that we would hopefully the material or the information that says guides working groups towards deciding whether or not to use GitHub is fairly static and should not change at this point. So, Chair Hadoff, I think that would be useful to certainly perhaps refactor things a different way, either within the context of this single document, or to have the more dynamic material elsewhere is a separate question to be addressed, whether it goes through this potential experiment that the ISG might consider, or a wiki page or something. But yeah, I think there's value in really honing in and solidifying the concrete static material sooner rather than later.
Alyssa Cooper, yeah, I think maybe the right next step is to, within this document, just try to separate those things out so we can see like how much of the how much material is there really for a BCP 25 update if it's like 3 normative statements or if it's like more than that, and then figure out if like splitting that off makes sense or not. And I think if it does get split off, advancing the configuration document and the BCP 25 update at the same time would probably be most helpful for the community's understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah, agreed.
So Alyssa, before you go, so the charter for this working group doesn't involve changing IETF processes. And
Do you have it? Actually, I was going to look at it. Does it say that we will not, does it explicitly we will not change process?
But if it becomes clear that we're changing IETF processes, we're going to need a much larger room, regardless of how many people sign the blue sheet. And I would rather, and as chair, I would rather that not land in our lap. We might say, here are some things that are useful for that, but I would rather, if there's a document coming out that's going to actually change IETF process, that it not be discussed in this working group. That's going to be an attractive nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
So the charter's kind of says don't change what we're doing in 2026. I don't see it as any of that. I see this as adding to the set of processes that the organization operates by, not changing any of the existing ones. And I think that's a little, the charter, I think, allows for that. So I think the mistake was saying that we were talking about an update to BCP 25. What I think we're talking about is a new BCP that may be the 3 paragraphs that Alyssa was talking about, but a new BCP that says you may do this. More a formal statement of the acceptance of what's going on already today.
Yeah, so, the charter says that it will not alter BCP 9. It doesn't say anything about BCP 25. It says it will not alter the standards process, parentheses, BCP 9.
I like the new Ecker who's no longer on the ISG.
Yeah, well, I reviewed this, obviously, but maybe not carefully enough. But, then...
Because BCP 25 is the one that we have about working group processes, right? So I think Martin's correct with adding more process to what working groups can do. It probably should be an update to BCP 9. Actually, we don't even update BCPs; we update RFCs anyway. We don't need to talk about it. But I think we can add. Adding guidance to what working groups can do is a fine thing for this working group to do.
Right.
It seems to be within the charter, and we're not changing the standards process at all.
Okay, as long as we're not changing the standard process at all, like I said, I just don't think that this working group would be the approach. I mean, if that came to this working group, I think that it would change the flavor of the working group massively.
Right. I mean, with that said, I think that, that we just don't debate whether or not things were good ideas. I can certainly imagine some uses of GitHub for consensus testing, which I would not be in favor of, even if they were in scope for the working group.
Lingering question?
I have a new topic, so I was just waiting to put that one to bed. Does anyone want to volunteer to co-author this document with me? Just putting that out there while there's a large audience. I see Mark Nottingham volunteering right there. Excellent. Oh yeah, that was a volunteer. That was if no one else does, I will for the minutes. Oh, Rich is going to say that too. You two can fight each other for the honor.
So, Martin, I suggest that you put the 00 working group 00 on the list with just you, unless you have an active one. But you start the discussion with you would like a co-author.
I'm just offering the opportunity to someone. I have plenty of work. Who volunteered? We're indistinguishable anyway, so.
Once it's a working group document, the working group chairs can solicit more heavily for a co-author for you. I understand.
I
hear that
opportunity.
And then Mark saying, "Listen, okay, great."
I'm happy to help if you think it'd be useful.
Great, thank you, Mike.
I mean, while I think all the people whose names were just mentioned were fine people, what might actually be helpful would be an author who was from a sort of more light tradition working group because while I have much confidence in Martin Thompson, he's obviously from the sort of heavy GitHub tradition, and so it might be helpful to have someone from a light tradition to me. It's like one thing to have to have people paying attention there, to have someone who is invested in that.
Yeah, we will deal with that. Martin, feel free to submit the OO, and then we'll work out the authorship later on. I don't think it's a big deal. I guess on that note, we don't really have anything else to discuss unless there's more pressing issues. Going once, going twice. All right, we will adjourn here. Thanks, everyone.
Blue sheets up to the front, please. Actually, tell you what, flip the blue sheets, I can jump in, Jeff.
Can
Yes.